So now let's discuss Omnisphere's live mode. We can load patches into the main page through the patch browser. Click on the folder icon. Search by category. Let's look for pads and strings. Once we select a category, our search field is narrowed considerably, but we still have dozens or hundreds of patches within the category. We can mix things up by pressing the shuffle button so that we're not always looking at the A patches first. But if you know what you're looking for, either by keyword or title, we can type it in and press enter. I'll type in lush. Narrows the search down considerably, and we'll load lush ambient string orchestra. That's great. To load in part 2, we can, of course, use the patch browser on the main page. But now we're going to take a look at the multi-view. And the first tab in multi-view is the mixer. We see 8 parts here, each laid out with a MIDI channel assignment and so forth. There's also a patch browser for each of these 8 parts. You may have noticed I've selected the patch browser within the mixer. This time I'm going to type in a keyword without going to a particular category and look for those spacey sign arps that we used before. They were great. So I find spacey sign arps using this patch browser and loaded it into part 2. I'm still hearing the lush orchestra when I play the PC-88 keyboard. Note that the MIDI channel assignments are MIDI channel 1 for part 1 and channel 2 for part 2 by default. So if I change the channel assignment of my Oxygen 8 keyboard to channel 2, then the incoming notes will trigger the spacey sign arps part 2 in the mixer. Okay, so I can trigger by MIDI channel when the mixer mode is in its default state. Now we go to our live mode tab and turn on the power switch. We have 2 parts loaded in right here, and we can load additional parts right on this page by turning on the mixer tab and looking for the folder icons that appear next to each part. So now I'll load in 2 more parts, 3 and 4, directly from the live page. I'll load in a Rhodes sound and a Dream piano sound to layer. So that's 3 places you can access the patch browser: the main page, the mixer, or the live mode view. Great, we have 4 parts loaded and we're in live mode. Now we can select a particular part simply using the mouse. When I select one part with the mouse, other parts automatically deselect. So when live mode is active, MIDI channel assignments no longer take precedence. Whatever is selected with the mouse will be sounding. Up here we can see there are 4 ways to select parts: mouse, MIDI controllers, MIDI program changes, and key selection. Right or control click on any part to assign a note to trigger that part on or off. Enable MIDI note learn, press the note on your controller keyboard, and the assignment is learned. I've assigned the top 4 white notes on my controller keyboard to trigger the 4 parts here. So the parts are assigned and can be triggered by pressing the notes G7 through C8. When notes are pressed, any previously selected parts are deselected or turned off, making it easy to switch from one part to another. But what's really cool is that notes that are sustained either by holding them down or using the sustain pedal will continue to sustain even if you switch away to another part. This makes the live transitions seamless. If you want to play 2 parts together as a stack, simply press the notes in a legato fashion so that they overlap. Here I pressed B7 and C8 at the same time, and I hear both parts together. But ouch, that is nasty. It's too loud. It's causing distortion in my host sequencer. Let's bring this channel strip over. We're going to go to our mixer, try and fix this problem. Ooh, nasty. So we see the channel strip is clipping. We'll go back to our mixer view and just lower the volumes of the respective parts that are coming into the host sequencer. Remember, in this mode, all of the different parts in the Omnisphere instance combine and come through a single channel strip in the host. So I'll adjust the levels in my mixer for parts 3 and 4 until they mesh. Now I'll check the strings and the sign arps part because they will be layered at certain points in the intro. So I'll lower the lush string orchestra, play it with the arps, which need to be pretty loud, lower them a little bit more. So now I have some great levels happening with the parts and we're no longer distorting in the host, and I can take this out of the way. That's great. So let's see how this works out in practice playing a live intro. I'll start by pressing G7 to select the string pad. At the end of this section, I'll continue to hold a few of the notes of the chord while I switch to the spacey sine arps part. Now I'm going to switch, sustain some of the notes, and continue with the new part. Now I'll release the string orchestra notes and sustain some of the spacey sine arps notes while switching to the psych Rhodes. Now I'm going to layer the Rhodes with the dream piano by pressing B and C together. And there you go. In the next chapter, we'll look at some of the more detailed settings when working with live mode. In the next 4 short videos, we'll examine the behaviors and modes available in the live mode settings. There are options for switching with the mouse, MIDI key select, MIDI controllers, or MIDI program changes. Let's go to the Zoom window or settings dialog for live mode. You'll find these throughout Omnisphere. Here, pressing the magnifying glass, we see all the settings for live mode. We see power switches to enable selection by MIDI controllers, program changes, or key selection, and pop-up settings to change the behavior of each of these parameters plus mouse selection mode. Let's go to mouse selection and change from touch to latch mode. In latch mode, we can select one part with the mouse. Parts that are already active will remain active. Each time you click on a part, it toggles its state from active to inactive. So, in latch mode, multiple parts can be active simultaneously, each toggled with a selection by the mouse. So, in touch mode, only one part at a time can be selected or active. In latch mode, each part is toggled independently, and multiple parts can be active together. Let's look at the behavior of MIDI key selection. Now I've assigned G7 through C8 to trigger 4 patches, and when pressing notes individually, the part is activated, other parts are deactivated. But when pressing notes in a legato fashion or together, multiple parts can be activated simultaneously. Let's go to our Zoom mode and look at the options for selection with keys. We're going to change from the default touch mode to latch mode. In latch mode, as before with the mouse, pressing the selector key once toggles the status of a part on or off. Once to turn on, again to turn off. In latch mode, parts that are already active will remain active if you toggle any other part. Okay, there's yet one more mode for MIDI key selection that we can look at. That mode is switch mode. So we go to our Zoom settings and change to switch mode. In switch mode, the key must actually be depressed for a part to be active. As soon as you release the key, the part becomes inactive. In this mode, you can have multiple active parts if you hold 2 or 3 selector keys down at the same time. So we have 3 key switch modes. Touch, our default. Latch, toggling parts independently. And switch, where parts are only active while the trigger note is being held down. Okay, let's go to selection by MIDI program change. MIDI program changes can be sent either from your controller keyboard or, as in this case, from your host sequencer. So we're going to right-click on the part and go to MIDI program change learn, and then send a program change message of 0 from my host sequencer. Notice that we're showing MIDI program change numbers on the left-hand column. I go to each part, right-click and select MIDI program change, then send the program change message, and that message is learned. So I've assigned MIDI program changes 0 through 3 using messages from my host. When I send these program changes again after they're learned, they'll activate the selected part. Other parts will become inactivated. Under the live mode zoom settings, we can change the numbering scheme for program changes, as there are several conventions. So I'll change the convention in Omnisphere to number from 0 to 127 to match my host sequencer. And now the numbers should match. The final method of selection is with MIDI controllers, so we'll go to Show MIDI CCs. If we go to our zoom settings, we'll see that the default mode for MIDI CC selection is switch mode. Let's close zoom settings. Now we're going to go to MIDI CC Learn and assign 2 button controllers to the first 2 parts. These buttons have alternating values of 0 and 127 that they send out with each consecutive button press. So we'll learn these 2 for parts 1 and 2. When I press the button once, a value of 127 will activate the part. A button press again will send out a value of 0 and the part will become inactive. Now let's go to our zoom settings and go over to a different MIDI CC selection mode, touch mode. This time, we'll right-click on each part and assign different buttons on my controller. These buttons always send out a value of 127 every time they're depressed. So with MIDI CC Learn, we assign controllers 20 through 23 through the 4 parts. Notice that the 4 parts all respond to these new controllers, although the first 2 parts still show their old MIDI CC assignments. In touch mode, every time I press one button, the other active parts are deselected. Right-click on a part to show learns, that is all learned assignments. And here we see that multiple assignments can coexist together to activate each part. That can come in quite handy. And once again, in touch mode, selecting one part deactivates any other active parts. Now let's go to our zoom settings and look at the final mode available for MIDI CC Select, latch mode. As in the other methods of selection, in latch mode, the MIDI controller, sending a value of 127, toggles the status of a part on and off with each press, and multiple parts can be active together. So here, I'll press the button once to turn off part 1. Second button to turn off part 2. And then with 3 buttons pressed together, the part that's off turns on and the parts that are on turn off. So we have 3 modes, switch, touch, and latch. Switch and latch modes both allow multiple parts to be active together. Switch is great for buttons that toggle between values of 0 and 127. And touch is great for buttons with one value, when you know you only want one active part at any time. So now let's take a look at dual live mode and working with Omnisphere multi-timbrally. We're going to go to live mode and turn it on. Using this button here, we're able to view the mixer mode in live mode. These folder icons open up the patch browser for each of the 8 parts. And in part 1, I'll load an arpeggiated guitar sample. For part 2, I'm going to load a choir sound. Now, in regular live mode, I can trigger one or both of these sounds with any MIDI controller keyboard. Incoming MIDI channel is completely ignored in this case. But we're going to go to our zoom settings for live mode and check this button here, Dual Live. Our settings are now duplicated and we have 2 completely independent live modes that are available for 2 separate MIDI controller keyboards. The first keyboard, transmitting on MIDI channel 1, will trigger parts 1 through 4. My second MIDI keyboard, transmitting on MIDI channel 2, will trigger parts 5 through 8. We can now close our live mode settings with the magnifying glass. Here we see that part assignments with their patches can be moved up or down from slot to slot, or from one keyboard to another. In dual mode, active patches are highlighted in white for keyboard 2 and highlighted in blue for keyboard 1. Now let's set up some MIDI controller assignments. first will show MIDI CCs instead of part numbers. Then we'll right-click on the first part for keyboard 2 and choosing MIDI CC layer and assign controller number 20. PC88 keyboard 1 triggers the arpeggiated part on the left side, and the oxygenate transmitting on channel 2 is triggering the choir sound on the right side. Let's assign another patch to part 3 that we'll use to layer with our choir sound. I'm going to choose this E-bode piano harmonics patch. Going back to our live mode view, we'll assign this to controller number 21. So now I've assigned 2 MIDI controllers, one to each of the 2 parts being triggered by keyboard number 2. My MIDI CC selection mode is latch mode. Each time I press controller 20, the choir will toggle on or off, and the same for the E-bode piano harmonic swell with controller 21. Here, keyboard 1 has triggered the arpeggiated samples, still sustained with the pedal. Keyboard number 2 is triggering the choir. Then, controller 21 allows me to layer in a second texture on top of the pad, using keyboard number 2. Well, that's great for a live performance mode, but now let's consider the situation where we want to use these parts with our host sequencer. Use Omnisphere multi-timbrely, one single instance of the plugin, playing multiple parts from multiple tracks in our sequencer on different MIDI channels. In order for this to happen, we have to disable live mode. We'll turn off the power here. In our mixer, we can see that our 3 parts are assigned to receive on channels 1, 2, and 3, respectively. The 3 tracks in my sequencer are ascending on MIDI channels 1, 2, and 3, respectively as well. I lowered the volume a little on the E-bode layer, so my first track is triggering the arpeggiated sound in part 1. Now let's jump ahead to when the pads enter. Here come the pads, sending on channel 2, and Omnisphere responds. I've taken the MIDI performance at the end of the pad part, adjusted its level in Omnisphere's mixer, and transposed the part up an octave in my sequencer. And here comes the E-bode piano transposed up an octave. So, we jumped from using Omnisphere in dual live mode to trigger different parts with multiple keyboards. Then we expanded out with our sequencer by laying in different parts and assigning them different MIDI channels. With live mode turned off, the MIDI channel assignments in the mixer take effect. Another great performance option is Omnisphere's stack mode. Let's enable multi-view. Here's the mixer. Go to the stack tab. Here's where patches are loaded and adjusted. These are the 3 methods of sliding between the different crossfades and layers. We'll turn on or activate stack mode here. And now we're going to load in 4 patches. We can make our job easier in the patch browser by going to the system settings and enabling synced tabbed panes together. This will keep the patch browser open as I move from part to part. Additionally, since I'm working with a custom category, I can make sure that the category doesn't keep reverting to the all category every time I switch parts by going to this browser zoom setting called browser synchronization. I've enabled it. That means that as I go to part 2, the patch browser stays open and my custom category remains selected. So I can quickly move through the 4 parts and select the 4 patches. Okay, so I've loaded 4 custom patches and I'm ready to go to show you stack mode. Let's go back to our multi-view. You can see that I have the 4 parts visible both in the mixer and in the stack view. And if I play the keyboard, we'll hear that all 4 patches play together at full volume. So we'll go to the mixer mode and lower the volume of some of these patches. Keep in mind here that MIDI channel assignments are again overridden with stack mode active. That's why we hear all 4 patches. So let's adjust the levels, bring down that brass. Let's also adjust our pan settings so that some of the patches move around from side to side in the stereo field. So that's our sound with all 4 patches playing together. Now let's adjust the response of these parts to key range which is our currently selected option on top, notes. We do this by dragging either the left or right edge of the bars to limit their range, or dragging the upper left or upper right to create a crossfade in or out as we move up and down the keyboard. So I'll set the brass to fade in starting halfway up the keyboard, reaching full volume, about 3/4 of the way up. The tubular choir is set to begin fading in at the very lowest notes and just get louder and louder. And the Tibetan bowls will both fade in and fade out. They'll start fading in 1/3 of the way up, get to full volume, and then fade down before we get to the highest notes, while the bell sign patch is at full volume throughout the key range. Note we can also select velocity, but we're interested in using our mod wheel to control these crossfades. So we'll switch to CC mode, and then choose a specific MIDI controller up here on the left. We have MIDI channel selection on the left, in this case any, and MIDI controller. Let's readjust our mix just a little bit. All right, let's take a look for a minute at triggering these different stacks that we've set up with MIDI velocity. Choosing velocity as our mode, we can play soft or hard on the MIDI keyboard and move through the different mixes we've set up to the left or the right. Switching the mode to notes means that as we play lower on the keyboard, we're triggering the stacks to the left of the grid and moving through the stacks as we move higher and higher on the keyboard. Okay, let's go back to MIDI CC mode. We're going to use the mod wheel to sweep through these different layers, and we'll see how it sounds with this piece of music here. And keep your eye on the blue bar at the bottom as we sweep up. Okay, there you see the mod wheel starting to fade in the tubular choir just a bit. Here are the Tibetan bowls, and we're going to bring in the brass sound now. Just in time for that low note there. Everything's layered very nicely now. We're going to bring down those other layers and go back to our simple sine-like bell patch and fade out.